Welcome back to Edgar Cayce Narratives. If you've been here before, you already know this channel explores patterns that feel real but are hard to explain. Today's story is simple on the surface, but it carries something deeper. It's about a person who struggles to trust anyone, even when there is no clear reason to doubt. Nothing obvious is wrong, and yet something inside keeps holding back. As we go through this, you may start to recognize parts of this pattern, not just in others, but possibly in your own reactions, your relationships, and the way you respond when someone gets close to you. Someone does something kind for you, and on the surface it looks normal. They check in on you, offer help without being asked, or say something thoughtful at the right moment. There is no pressure, no expectation, and no clear reason to doubt it. From the outside, this is the kind of interaction most people would accept without hesitation. It is simple, human, and easy to receive. But inside, something else happens almost immediately, and it does not match the situation in front of you. Instead of feeling warmth, your mind starts asking questions that feel automatic and hard to stop. Why would they do that for me? What do they actually want? Is there something behind this that I'm not seeing yet? These thoughts do not come from clear evidence. They appear quickly, almost as if they were already waiting in the background. You do not say them out loud, and most of the time you do not even show them on your face. But internally, the moment has already changed from something safe into something uncertain. You might still respond politely. You might even say thank you and act like everything is fine. But at the same time, you begin to pull back just enough to stay protected. You do not fully relax into the moment, and you do not let the interaction land in a real way. There is always a small distance that you keep, even if the other person has done nothing to create it. It is not a decision you sit down and make. It happens on its own, quickly and quietly, like a reflex that has been practiced many times before. If this happens once, it could be dismissed as overthinking or a bad mood. But what makes it harder to ignore is how often it repeats. The same reaction shows up in different situations, with different people and at different times. Whether someone is being kind, supportive, or simply present, the internal response stays similar. There is always a layer of doubt that appears before trust has a chance to form. Even when you want to believe the moment is genuine, something inside you resists that feeling. Over time, you start to notice that this reaction is not really about the people in front of you. Some of them are consistent, respectful, and clear in their actions. They are not giving you strong reasons to question them, and yet the questioning still happens. It becomes harder to explain because the pattern does not match the reality you are seeing. You are not reacting to what is actually happening. You are reacting to something else that feels just as real, even if you cannot point to it directly. And this is where the experience becomes confusing. On one level, you can see that nothing is wrong. On another level, you still cannot let your guard down. The situation is safe, but your response is not. You are present in the moment, but part of you is already preparing for something that has not happened. That gap between what is real and what you feel is where the pattern begins to reveal itself, even if you do not fully understand it yet. At first, it might seem like these reactions only happen in certain moments, but over time, a clearer pattern starts to form. It shows up in friendships, where conversations stay on the surface because going deeper feels risky for reasons you cannot fully explain. You might listen well, respond thoughtfully, and even be present, but there is always a limit to how much of yourself you allow others to see. When someone tries to move closer emotionally, something inside you slows the process down or redirects it without making it obvious. The connection exists, but it never feels fully open. In romantic relationships, the pattern becomes more visible and harder to manage. When things start to feel real, when the other person becomes consistent, caring, and emotionally available, instead of feeling secure, you begin to feel uncertain. You might start paying closer attention to small details, reading into changes in tone, timing, or behavior that most people would overlook. A delayed message, a short response, or a slight shift in energy can trigger a chain of thoughts that quickly turns into doubt. You begin to question intentions, even when there is no clear evidence that anything is wrong. This often leads to a need for control in emotional situations, not in an obvious or aggressive way, but in subtle internal ways that shape how you respond. You may hold back certain thoughts, avoid expressing needs directly, or test the other person without saying what you are doing. Sometimes this looks like pulling away slightly to see if they notice, or staying guarded to avoid being the one who depends too much. The goal is not to hurt anyone. The goal is to stay one step ahead of a situation that feels unpredictable, even when it is not. Even in relationships that are stable and supportive, the same pattern continues to operate. You might find yourself checking for hidden motives without realizing how often you are doing it. When someone is kind, you question why. When someone stays consistent, you wonder how long it will last. When someone shows care, part of you starts preparing for the moment that care might disappear. This creates a quiet tension in relationships that are otherwise safe, because you are never fully able to settle into them. Over time, this way of responding begins to affect the structure of your relationships. People may feel that you are distant, even if you are physically present and engaged in conversation. They may sense that something is being held back, even if they cannot clearly define what it is. Some may try to get closer and eventually feel discouraged when the distance does not change. Others may stop trying altogether, not because they do not care, but because they cannot find a way past the barrier that is always there. As this repeats across different relationships, a gradual shift begins to happen. Connections become weaker, not because there is no potential, but because they are never fully allowed to grow. You may find yourself with fewer people you truly rely on, even if you are surrounded by others. There is interaction, there is communication, but there is a lack of depth that becomes more noticeable over time. The result is not sudden isolation, but a slow movement toward it, shaped by many small moments where trust could have formed but did not. What makes this pattern difficult to break is that it does not feel like a choice. It feels like a natural response, something that happens before you have time to think about it. Even when you recognize it, even when part of you wants to respond differently, the same reactions continue to appear. You might tell yourself to relax, to give the situation a chance, to stop overanalyzing, but those thoughts rarely change what happens in the moment. The pattern is consistent, and it follows you across different people and different environments. At some point, you begin to notice that the common factor in all these situations is not the people around you, but your own internal response. The details change, the faces change, the context changes, but the reaction remains the same. This realization does not immediately solve anything, but it makes the pattern harder to ignore. It becomes clear that this is not about one bad experience or one difficult relationship. It is something that has settled deeper, something that continues to shape how you see others before they have a chance to show who they really are. At a certain point, the pattern is no longer just something you notice in your behavior. It becomes something you feel directly as a conflict inside yourself. On one side, there is a clear desire for connection, and it is not vague or abstract. You want to feel close to someone, to be understood without having to explain everything, and to experience a relationship where you can relax without constantly thinking ahead. This part of you is real, and it shows up in quiet moments when you imagine what it would feel like to trust someone without hesitation. At the same time, there is another response that moves just as quickly and often faster. The moment a connection starts to feel real, something inside you begins to tighten. It is not always a clear thought, but more like a shift in your body and your attention. You start to become more alert, more aware of small changes, and more focused on what could go wrong. Even if nothing has happened, the sense of risk begins to grow, and it becomes harder to stay open in the way you were just a moment before. This creates a contradiction that is difficult to resolve because both sides feel true at the same time. You are not someone who avoids people completely, and you are not someone who does not care about relationships. In fact, you may put effort into maintaining them, showing up, and being present when it matters. But underneath that effort, there is always a limit that you cannot seem to move past. You want connection, but you cannot allow the level of vulnerability that connection requires. At times, this contradiction becomes clear in your own thoughts, even if you do not say them out loud. You might notice a moment where you think, "I want to trust this person," and almost immediately, another thought follows, "But I don't feel safe doing that." These thoughts do not feel like choices. They feel like automatic responses that happen before you can control them. The result is that you stay in a middle space, not fully closed, but never fully open either. The emotional cost of this becomes more visible over time. There are moments when you feel alone, even when you are in contact with others. Conversations may happen, plans may be made, and relationships may continue, but something still feels incomplete. You may find yourself wondering why it is so difficult to feel close to people in the way you see others experience it. This question does not always have a clear answer, which makes the situation more frustrating. There is also a level of self-confusion that develops alongside this. You can see that some people in your life are trustworthy, consistent, and not giving you reasons to doubt them. You may even recognize that your reactions are stronger than the situation requires. But recognizing this does not change how you feel in the moment. The gap between what you understand and what you experience creates a sense of being stuck, as if you are aware of the pattern but unable to step outside of it. Over time, this can lead to a quiet kind of exhaustion. You are not only managing relationships, but also managing your own responses to those relationships. You are constantly balancing the desire to move closer with the need to stay protected. This takes energy, even when nothing is visibly happening. The tension does not come from external conflict, but from the ongoing effort to hold both sides of yourself at once. And this is where the contradiction becomes most clear. You are not choosing distance because you do not care. You are creating distance because something in you believes it is necessary. Even when you want something different, even when you try to respond in a more open way, that internal response remains. It continues to shape your actions, your reactions, and your relationships in ways that are difficult to override. Up to this point, everything can still be explained on the surface level. It can be described as caution, past disappointment, or simply a personality that takes longer to trust. But the pattern starts to feel different when the reaction remains strong, even in situations that are clearly safe. This is where Edgar Cayce's perspective introduces a different way to look at what is happening, not as a reaction to the present moment alone, but as something shaped much earlier and carried forward. In many of Cayce's readings, trust is not treated as a simple choice or a skill that can be improved with effort. It is described more like a state that develops from repeated experiences of safety or repeated experiences of betrayal. When trust is broken in a significant way, especially in a way that affects identity, the impact does not stay limited to that one moment. It becomes part of how the person responds to future situations, even when those situations are different. From this perspective, the pattern you are experiencing may not come from one event or one relationship in your current life. It may come from a deeper imprint, something that formed when trust was not just disappointed, but completely disrupted. This kind of experience does not simply fade over time. It can shape how safe or unsafe connection feels at a very basic level, long before conscious thought has a chance to intervene. What makes this idea important is not whether you believe in past lives or not. The value comes from how it reframes the intensity of your reaction. If the response feels stronger than the current situation justifies, then it suggests that the source of that response may not be limited to what you can clearly remember. The reaction begins to make more sense when you consider that it could be connected to something that has not been fully processed or resolved. In this context, your current behavior is not random, and it is not a flaw in your personality. It is a form of protection that has been activated for a long time and has never been fully turned off. The system is still doing what it was designed to do, which is to prevent the same kind of harm from happening again. The problem is that it does not always recognize when the situation has changed. This is why the response can feel automatic and difficult to control. It is not being decided in the moment. It is being triggered based on a deeper association between trust and risk. Even when the person in front of you is consistent, clear, and safe, the internal system is still responding as if something could go wrong at any time. It is not evaluating the present. It is reacting to a pattern that has already been established. Seen this way, the distance you create in relationships is not simply avoidance. It is a strategy that has been repeated so many times that it has become part of how you function. You are not just choosing to stay guarded. You are following a response that was built to protect you in a different context, but continues to operate in your current life. This reframing changes how the pattern is understood. Instead of asking, "Why can't I trust people?" the question becomes, "What experience taught me that trust is dangerous?" That shift matters because it moves the focus away from judgment and toward understanding. It also explains why trying to force trust through logic or effort often does not work, because the response is not coming from a place that logic can easily reach. At the same time, this perspective does not suggest that the pattern is permanent. It explains why it exists and why it feels so strong, but it also implies that anything learned or carried can be understood and gradually changed. The protection was necessary at some point, but that does not mean it has to remain active in every situation. Recognizing it as a system, rather than a fixed trait, is the first step in seeing that it can respond differently over time. And this is where the idea becomes practical. If trust feels unsafe, then the goal is not to force yourself to trust immediately. The goal is to understand the system that keeps you guarded and to begin creating new experiences that slowly show it that not every situation leads to the same outcome. The change does not happen all at once, but it becomes possible once the pattern is seen for what it is. When you step back and look beyond a single life or a single situation, this pattern starts to appear in many different people, even when their backgrounds are not the same. Some grew up in stable environments, others did not, and some cannot point to any clear moment where trust was broken in a major way. But the internal response looks very similar. The hesitation, the constant scanning for risk, and the difficulty allowing someone to get close all follow the same structure. Even if the stories behind them are different, you might see someone who appears confident and independent on the outside. Someone who manages their life well and does not rely on others easily. They are capable, responsible, and often seen as strong by the people around them. But when it comes to emotional closeness, the same barrier appears. They keep conversations controlled, share only what feels safe, and rarely let others see uncertainty or need. The pattern is not visible at first, but it becomes clear over time. In another case, the pattern shows up in someone who actively seeks connection, but repeatedly pulls back once things start to feel real. They may enter relationships with openness in the beginning, but as soon as consistency and emotional closeness increase, the same reaction begins. Doubt appears, distance grows, and the relationship becomes harder to maintain. From the outside, it can look confusing or inconsistent, but internally, the response follows a familiar path. There are also people who appear calm and agreeable in relationships, who avoid conflict and try to keep things stable. They may not question others openly, and they may not show obvious signs of distrust. But internally, the same process is happening. They are observing, analyzing, and staying prepared for the possibility that something could change. The trust is never fully settled, even if the relationship continues for a long time. What connects all of these variations is not the surface behavior, but the underlying response. In each case, trust does not form easily, and when it does, it remains fragile. The person is not reacting only to what is happening now. They are responding to something that feels familiar, even if they cannot explain why. The details change, but the structure of the reaction stays the same. This is what makes the pattern feel larger than a single experience. It shows up across different personalities, different life paths, and different environments. Some people become more guarded and distant, while others become more involved and then withdraw. Some control their emotions tightly, while others fluctuate between openness and doubt. The expressions vary, but the core dynamic does not. Seeing this pattern across different people helps remove the idea that this is a personal failure or a unique problem that only a few individuals face. It shows that there is a common mechanism at work, something that shapes how trust is experienced at a deeper level. When multiple people with different histories arrive at similar responses, it suggests that the pattern is not random. It follows a structure that can be observed and understood. At the same time, this broader view also highlights how easy it is to misunderstand the pattern when looking from the outside. Someone who struggles to trust may be seen as distant, overly cautious, or difficult to connect with. Their behavior can be interpreted as disinterest or lack of effort, even when that is not the case. Without understanding the internal experience, the reaction can be misread, which often leads to further distance in relationships. As you recognize this pattern in different forms, it becomes easier to see that it is not tied to a specific type of person or a specific situation. It is a way of responding that can take on many shapes, but always follows the same core movement. Trust is approached carefully, held at a distance, and never fully allowed to settle. And once you see how consistently this pattern appears, it becomes harder to dismiss it as coincidence or simple overthinking. If we step away from the Cayce perspective for a moment and look at this through modern psychology, a very similar pattern appears, but it is described using different language. In psychology, this is often connected to attachment patterns, especially forms of attachment where safety in relationships was inconsistent or unclear. When early experiences do not provide a stable sense of emotional safety, the mind learns to stay alert, even in situations that are not immediately threatening. This is not a conscious choice. It becomes a learned response that continues into later relationships. In attachment theory, this can show up as anxious or avoidant tendencies, or sometimes a mix of both. An anxious pattern may involve wanting closeness, but constantly worrying about losing it, while an avoidant pattern may involve creating distance to avoid being hurt. In some cases, both responses exist together, creating a push and pull dynamic where a person moves toward connection, and then pulls back once it starts to feel real. This combination closely mirrors the contradiction we described earlier, where the desire for trust exists alongside the inability to fully allow it. From this point of view, the reaction you experience is not random or exaggerated without reason. It is based on learned associations between closeness and risk. If trust was linked to disappointment, inconsistency, or emotional instability at some point, the mind adapts by becoming more cautious. It begins to look for signs that something might go wrong, not because something is currently wrong, but because it has learned that safety is not guaranteed. However, there is an important detail that stands out in cases like this. The intensity of the reaction often feels stronger than what the current situation justifies. You may be dealing with people who are consistent, respectful, and not showing clear signs of harm, and yet the internal response remains high. This creates a gap between what is happening externally and what is being experienced internally. That gap is what makes the pattern feel confusing and difficult to resolve. Psychology explains part of this by pointing to implicit memory, which is a type of memory that influences behavior without being consciously recalled. These are not always clear, detailed memories that you can describe. They are stored as emotional responses, body reactions, and automatic expectations. When a situation resembles something that was previously associated with risk, even in a subtle way, the response can be triggered without a clear explanation. This is why logic alone often does not change the pattern. You can understand that a person is trustworthy, you can see consistent behavior, and you can even tell yourself that there is no reason to worry. But the response does not fully shift because it is not being generated by conscious reasoning. It is being activated at a deeper level, where the goal is protection rather than accuracy. Another concept that helps explain this is hypervigilance, which is a state where the mind stays alert for potential threats, even when none are obvious. In relationships, this can look like constantly analyzing behavior, tone, timing, and small changes that might indicate a shift. The person is not trying to create problems, they are trying to prevent them. But this constant monitoring keeps the system active and makes it difficult to relax into the relationship. At the same time, psychology also recognizes that these patterns can persist even when the original conditions are no longer present. The environment may have changed, the people may be different, and the situation may be safer, but the response continues because it has been reinforced over time. Each moment of caution confirms the need for more caution, creating a cycle that is hard to interrupt. When you compare this to the Cayce perspective, the language is different, but the structure is similar. Both suggest that the response is rooted in something that was learned or experienced earlier and continues to influence the present. Both explain why the reaction can feel automatic, strong, and difficult to change through effort alone. And both point to the same core idea, which is that trust is not just about what is happening now, but about what the mind has learned to expect over time. Understanding this parallel matters because it grounds the experience in something observable and real. It shows that you are not imagining the pattern, and you are not reacting without cause. At the same time, it also shows that the response is not fixed. If it was learned, it can be updated. But that process requires more than simply deciding to think differently. It requires new experiences that slowly change what safety feels like in a real, consistent way. At the center of this pattern, there is one idea that changes how everything else is understood. Trust is not just a decision you make in the moment. It is a memory of what safety has felt like over time. And that memory shapes how you respond before you have time to think. When that memory is unstable or tied to risk, the response will reflect that, no matter how much you try to approach the situation logically. This is why telling yourself to just trust more rarely works in a lasting way. You can understand the situation clearly. You can recognize that the person in front of you is consistent and not giving you reasons to doubt them. And you can even decide that you want to respond differently. But when the moment arrives, the same hesitation appears because the response is not coming from a conscious choice. It is coming from a deeper layer that is trying to protect you based on what it has learned before. In this sense, the difficulty with trust is not a lack of effort or awareness. It is a mismatch between what your mind understands and what your system expects. One part of you is evaluating the present, while another part is reacting based on past associations that still feel active. The result is that you cannot fully rely on logic to guide your response, because the reaction happens before logic can take control. This also explains why the pattern continues even when you are aware of it. Awareness helps you see what is happening, but it does not immediately change the response. You may notice the doubt as it appears, recognize that it is not fully justified, and still feel it just as strongly. This can create frustration because it feels like you are doing everything right on the surface, but nothing is shifting underneath. When you look at it this way, the goal is no longer to force trust through effort or to remove doubt completely. The goal is to understand that trust develops the same way the pattern formed, through repeated experiences that gradually change what feels safe. It is not built in a single moment, and it is not created by a single decision. It forms slowly, through consistent interactions where nothing goes wrong, and where the system begins to register that a different outcome is possible. This means that progress may feel subtle at first. It may show up as small changes, like staying present a little longer, questioning your own doubt without immediately acting on it, or allowing a moment of openness without pulling back right away. These changes do not remove the pattern instantly, but they begin to shift how it operates over time. The key insight here is simple but important. If trust feels difficult, it is not because you are incapable of trusting. It is because your system has learned to associate trust with risk, and it is still responding in a way that once made sense. When that is understood, the pattern becomes less about something being wrong with you, and more about something that can be gradually updated through new experiences that show a different result. At this point, the question is no longer about whether you should trust more or less. It becomes something more direct and more personal. When you notice that moment of hesitation, when someone is kind and part of you starts to pull back, what is the feeling underneath that reaction? Is it fear, uncertainty, or a sense that something could change without warning? Instead of pushing that response away, you can start by simply noticing it and asking where it comes from. If trust feels difficult, it may not be because of the person in front of you. It may be connected to something that still feels unresolved, even if you cannot clearly name it. The reaction is not random, and it is not happening without reason. It is pointing to something that your system is still trying to protect, even if the current situation does not require that level of protection. So the question becomes simple, but not always easy to answer. When you feel that distance appear, when you hesitate to fully open up, what are you expecting to happen next? Are you waiting for something to go wrong, even when there is no clear sign that it will? And if that expectation is there, where did it begin? And what experience made it feel necessary to stay guarded in the first place? You do not need to answer this all at once, and you do not need to force a conclusion. The value is in asking the question honestly and allowing yourself to sit with it. Because once you start to see the pattern clearly, even in small moments, it becomes easier to understand what you are protecting and why it has been so difficult to let that protection go. If this story felt familiar in any way, take a moment to notice which part stayed with you the most, because that usually points to something personal. If you found value in this, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing to Edgar Cayce Narratives, so you don't miss future stories that explore patterns like this in a clear and grounded way. And if something in this video still feels unclear, or if there is a part you want to understand more deeply, leave a comment and share your question, because those questions often shape what we explore next. You can also share your own experience if you feel comfortable, especially if you've noticed this pattern in your life or in your relationships, because hearing different perspectives helps build a clearer picture of how these patterns actually work. And if there is a topic you want to see next, something you've been thinking about but haven't found a clear explanation for, let me know in the comments, because that's how many of these stories begin.